This is CBS.
You expressed another thought, and that is,
well, there's always the possibility that the Iraqi gunners are opening up. They're pretty nervous, too. Reconnaissance aircraft could be operating over Iraqi airspace, and they're just firing. I don't know.
and we'll find out as time goes on, of course, but we have not heard, I think it's important to stress, anything beyond those initial reports of flashes of light being seen out on the horizon, out around Baghdad. General, let's talk for a minute about this whole business of the cruise missile and exactly what it is. It is actually a jet-powered missile, is it not?
That's right. The cruise missile is what is known as a land attack missile. It's fired from cruisers, from battleships, from destroyers and submarines. We have them here in the Red Sea. There are some in the Mediterranean, and we have them here in the Persian Gulf. Now, this missile has a range of about 1,100 miles, and it's a smart missile. It's an interesting missile. It has in its brain a picture map of the ground that it's going to fly over. So as it starts to fly out, it looks down at the ground and compares it to what it's been programmed for. Flies along looking down at the ground, comparing it to where it's supposed to be. If it's slightly off, it'll change its course. Finally, it gets over the place where the target is. Airplanes, but maybe a command building, something like that. It looks down and says, aha, that's the picture of my target. It goes down and it explodes.
And you're talking about an 1,100-mile range, and if memory serves, this is about 1,000 miles across here.
About 1,000, but there are airfields, Bob, also on this side and running down along the Euphrates in here, these rivers. So it's within the ranges.
So these missiles would come from ships here, also from ships across the way in the Persian Gulf.
Right, and now from here, you see, we're only talking about 600 miles. So you're well within the ranges of the missiles from here.
Does it strike you as odd, and perhaps it's just because we've been unable to get any communications through, that we have not heard anything since those initial reports of flashes of light being seen?
Bob, I would expect that when, and maybe we have, gone in against this thing, it would be very violent, very heavy. There'd be a lot of engagements. If I was in Baghdad looking out to those airfields, I think I'd see more activity. Now, there are other airfields, other command centers that they're going to attack. But what they're after right now is to get the air defenses, get the airplanes while they're on the ground, and try to get those big missiles we've been talking about.
So it could be that these first reports we have heard are nothing more than simply nervous Iraqi anti-aircraft gunners firing into the night. Perhaps they are, perhaps they aren't.
Well, the military has an old saying, never believe the first report.
So we'll just have to wait and see what this means. We can't make a firm judgment at this point. Okay, back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Bob and General Christ. This is CBS News special coverage of what the Associated Press now calls war in the Middle East. The evening news, we will not be doing as the evening news tonight. We are now into this special coverage. Let me pause a second and emphasize what every reporter who's ever covered combat knows. One, particularly in the early stages of what appears to be airstrikes against Iraq, probably, we do not know, probably first and foremost cruise-type missile strikes against the Iraqis. Let me emphasize that in the early stages, misinformation, disinformation generally abounds. Secondly, even when we think we know something, we know very, very little. At this hour, we can't emphasize too much how little we know, how scanty the information is. Most of the information we have comes from official government sources. For example, that the F-15s took off from central Saudi Arabia for Iraq, that we know. Our eyewitnesses in Baghdad said they saw those flashes of light in the distance. They don't know what the flashes of light were or are. As one who was in Baghdad recently, I can say that once you get sort of locked into position in Baghdad, it's very hard to see what's happening on the outskirts. Yes, they could have been anti-aircraft fire from the Iraqis. Yes, they could have been U.S. airstrikes, but here's the point. We simply do not know what they were. Now, the first F-15E fighter bombers took off from Saudi Arabia at 12:50 a.m. That would be Saudi Arabia time. That would be at 4:50 p.m. this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time in the United States. The first F-15E fighter bombers. Now, those are manned fighter bombers, not to be confused with the cruise missiles. It's now confirmed by the U.S. military that they took off around 4:50 this afternoon, Eastern Time in the United States. The base's chief maintenance officer in Saudi Arabia, Colonel Ray Davies, said, and I quote, "This is history in the making." Now, the F-15E, so-called Eagle, is an attack fighter. It's the best U.S. fighter. It's generally considered on a worldwide basis to be the best in the world. It attacks targets on the ground and in the air, which is to say it's capable of air-to-air combat and also striking targets on the ground. It has air-to-air missiles and also bombs. Now, let me pause and say that the White House has given us a 2-minute caution. Something of import is about to happen at the White House. We'll be covering it live for you here as part of our CBS News coverage. It's clear war has begun in the Middle East. It is believed that U.S. fighter bombers are at this moment attacking Iraq and have been for several hours now. And it's believed that U.S. cruise-type missiles also are hitting targets inside Iraq. The Iraqi government was reported around midday today to be trying to move chemical weapons within reach of U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia. That's the situation as we await some official White House announcement. Marlin Fitzwater, the well-known spokesman for President Bush, has just told us just a few seconds ago that we could expect something at the White House. We know not what very shortly. We want to emphasize that the information that we began passing along from CBS News and our correspondents in Baghdad, in Saudi Arabia, at the Defense Department, and at the White House is now, following on behind that are coming reports from the wire services, principally the Associated Press, and the wire services are now confirming and quoting official U.S. military spokesmen with such quotes as history is in the making, and confirming that the fighter bombers, these are manned fighter bombers, this F-15E, and no one should have any illusions. Once these fighter bombers get over Iraq, casualties can be expected. Real war, real death, real wounds, real pain. We go now to the White House.
I have a statement by the President of the United States. The liberation of Kuwait has begun. In conjunction with the forces of our coalition partners, the United States has moved under the code name Operation Desert Storm to enforce the mandates of the United Nations Security Council. As of 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Operation Desert Storm forces were engaging targets in Kuwait and Iraq. President Bush will address the nation at 9:00 p.m. tonight from the Oval Office. I'll try to get you more as soon as we can. Thank you very much.
Marlin Fitzwater saying what he had to say at the White House, taking the biblical admonition, let your yeas be yeas and your nays be nays. As you saw, Fitzwater walked out, read what he had to say, and walked away, did not take any questions. But the most important thing is the President of the United States will address the United States, and for that matter the world, in about an hour and 52 minutes. That will be at 9 p.m. tonight, Eastern Time. Of course, our CBS News live coverage of what is now clearly, and it always brings a lump to your throat, but what is clearly war in the Middle East. We are now talking about matters of war and peace. Let's pause for a second again to absorb that and to know what's happening in these hours in and around the Persian Gulf, and go to our CBS News White House correspondent, Wyatt Andrews. Wyatt?
Dan, that announcement was quite brief, but Marlin Fitzwater actually managed to say a lot. First pointing out that Desert Shield has now become Desert Storm, and with that name, it's obvious that he is confirming what the wire services and David Martin were reporting earlier, that this has turned to war. The other interesting point, of course, Dan, other than the report that the President will address the nation at 9 o'clock, is that Fitzwater said that forces were being engaged in both Iraq and Kuwait, meaning that the theater of operations here in this brief disclosure by Fitzwater is not confined just to Iraq right now, but that